All right, folks, in English 2323, Dr. E again, and we're into the second part of the supplemental video for week number 9. So we talked about Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes as a character in the last video, and now we're moving into Robert Louis Stevenson and his text, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? So this is more of a novella. It's a bit longer than a short story that we dealt with in Conan Doyle, right? But we're talking about some authors who wrote and lived around the same time period. And so Stevenson is really well known for Treasure Island. Here he is, handsome devil. But you know, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a fascinating text, and it also was pretty polarizing because it was considered really kind of out there by an audience and very grim. So it's pretty fascinating. So Stevenson was born in 1850, so he's a little bit younger, right, than Arthur Conan Doyle. So Conan Doyle was born in 1839, but Conan Doyle lived until 1930, and Stevenson just did not have that many years. He was very ill. If you remember from the biography, he suffered quite a bit with respiratory issues. He was also born in Edinburgh, so he and Arthur Conan Doyle are both Scottish, right, and were educated and grew up in Edinburgh. They went to the same school, the same college, essentially. So he studied to be a barrister, so to go into the field of law, right, to argue law. That didn't work out for him, and that's okay. He had a lot of pressure from his father in various ways. He was just not very well. He suffered from poor health, like I said, throughout his life. And in order to kind of address that, he traveled a lot because the weather in England just wasn't really conducive to him being healthy. So warmer climates, right? So during this time and many years after, people who suffered from any kind of respiratory issues or, you know, tuberculosis, they would go to warmer climates because it just made it easier for their lungs to kind of handle breathing in and out and whatnot. So poor guy. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde falls into some interesting kind of genres. So we talked about genre in the last video, but here's a quote. It was Dr. Jekyll, right? This interesting character, both moral allegory and thriller, right, that established his reputation with the ordinary reader. So we're talking about Stevenson as an author. So it's this story that is both an allegory and a thriller, so thinking about genres, that created this reputation, right? Even though he ended up being much more well known for Treasure Island. So what is an allegory, right? So an allegory is considered a kind of mode that attempts to take what are abstract concepts, right, or values or beliefs, historical events, right, and kind of put them into some sort of story narrative. So examples: Gulliver's Travels, The Fairy Queen, Pilgrim's Progress, Paradise Lost. So these are things that, you know, good and evil are somehow transferred into characters or into the reality of these texts. So think of Paradise Lost, if you're familiar with it. It's about heaven and hell, angels and demons, and the whole story is about that good versus bad, right? These big stories. And so we're definitely seeing, y'all can't see me, I'm gesturing quite a bit with my hands. We're seeing that conflict between good and evil, right, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as characters, for sure, right? So that becomes an allegory or allegorical text, okay? Characterization, right? So here's a quote that kind of touches upon what I was just identifying. The names of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the two alter egos of the main character, have become shorthand, right, for the exhibition of wildly contradictory behavior, especially between private and public selves, right? So battle of good and evil. So when we're thinking about characterization, we have Utterson. Again, we talked about this in the last video for Conan Doyle's text. Names are specific. Utterson, right? He is uttering. He is the person or the character from whose perspective we gain all this information. Utterson is the one that is discovering, that is curious, that is trying to track down Mr. Hyde. He is the one that leads us through this journey. So he is uttering essentially this story. So the name is important, of course. Then there's Dr. Henry Jekyll, of course, and then Mr. Hyde. And I want you to note that in modern day parlance or discussion, oftentimes these are mixed up. So people will, if somebody's having a bad day or feeling some anger or responding in kind of an explosive way, they're like, oh, Dr. Jekyll. well, it ain't Dr. Jekyll, right? Dr. Jekyll is not the character that is known for having, a temper and being violent or things. It's actually Mr. Hyde, remember? So not to get those confused. It's almost like when we talk about Frankenstein. So Frankenstein is the name of the doctor. So it's Dr. Frankenstein, and he creates the monster. But a lot of times when people are thinking about a monster of some sort, they just automatically name that monster Frankenstein. But that's a misappropriation, right, of those names. So Utterson is the lawyer, right? And this is directly from the text, I have the Gutenberg project, and I copied and pasted here. So Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. This, y'all, happens to be like one of my favorite descriptions of a character and perhaps sentences in a text because it seems so contradictory, right? Stevenson is doing something really interesting with this character, right? Trying to establish and give us some sort of understanding of who he is. So a rugged countenance, so kind of a rough view, he's kind of a rough looking individual, and it was never lighted by a smile. So it seems like, oh, this dude never smiles. I mean, not somebody I want to be around. And then he gets into even more adjectives that go into characterization: cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, right? So he's just kind of an interesting fellow, backward in sentiment. So we're getting more into, like, he is kind of maybe an oddball, lean, long. Some of these could be talking about Sherlock Holmes, right? Dusty, dreary. And then we get to the kicker here, and yet somehow lovable. You gotta love Robert Louis Stevenson for that. So then we have Dr. Jekyll, right? And this is Lanyon from the text describing Jekyll. Again, characterization, and we're getting into some imagery, right, from the previous in here as well. But it is more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. So again, Lanyon speaking. He began to go wrong in mind. And though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, so for old time's sake, as they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man. Devilish becomes really an interesting choice in words, right? Such unscientific balderdash, added the doctor. So Dr. Jekyll has kind of got a reputation now as being somebody who's dabbling in some weird scientific studies, right? Flushing suddenly purple, Lanyon is flushing suddenly purple, would have a strange Damon and Pythias. And if you look at the footnote in the text for that, these are two inseparable twin characters from, I believe, Greek literature. So these developments in Dr. Jekyll's attitude and his science, right, how unscientific it is, would have drawn these two apart. So he's just, Lanyon is being very intense about his description of the change that has come over Jekyll. And then we have Mr. Hyde. Right, and so here's a description of Hyde when we're thinking about the character. So Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. So this is quite an interesting character, right? So he's almost a character that people can't quite put their finger on what about his appearance is off-putting to them. We certainly wouldn't use some of this language now. He had a displeasing smile, but then we get into some really interesting kinds of adjectives, right? Murderous mixture of timidity, right? So timid, being a little withheld, and boldness. So these are considered not to be, synonymous. These are not the same thing. They're very different and almost opposite. And he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. So this is definitely meant to be a really curious character. So we're thinking about duality and dichotomy. This is at the heart of this good versus evil allegorical element of this case, or of this text. The story has long been interpreted as a representation of the Victorian's bifurcated self. Bifurcated just means kind of split self. So two very distinctive attitudes. Jekyll is in every way a gentleman, but just beneath the surface lies baser desires that remain unspoken. He is the very personification of the dichotomy between outward gentility, right, being a gentleman and having, very polite mannerisms, and then on the other end of that, the dichotomy of that is inward lust, right? So two very different aspects of his personality. So I wanted to give you all a sense of just how popular these characters are. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has been told time and time again in different kinds of iterations. We have some films, right? And you can even look at Eddie Murphy's The Nutty Professor as kind of an example of the duality of character, right? And then we have a television show that aired a while back in 2015. So, Dr. Jekyll is still kind of one of those stories that last the test of time. Even more so, though, is Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is still so incredibly popular and interesting to fans. It kind of surprises me that Jekyll and Hyde doesn't have that same kind of why aren't we seeing more television episodes? Well, in a lot of television episodes or movies, we see this kind of good versus evil, but we don't have kind of the modern representation of this specific story. But we have movie versions or television versions of Sherlock Holmes. So this is the film series with Jude Law as Dr. Watson and Robert Downey Jr. as Sherlock Holmes, which is pretty interesting. It's kind of interesting. It takes place in the Victorian era. And then we have the very popular, if y'all are not familiar with the Sherlock series from the BBC and you have Netflix, I would definitely recommend you go take a look because it's a modern day kind of adaptation with Benedict Cumberbatch playing Sherlock Holmes, which he does very, very well. It's very impressive. And then Martin Freeman as the Dr. Watson character. So really good show, really good modern day version. But then we also have some really interesting things being done with Holmes in general. So we have Enola Holmes, which is a movie that was created by Netflix, right? It's about supposedly Sherlock Holmes's younger sister, right? So it's about this kind of female in this investigative role and a very kind of rambunctious and intelligent, curious character. And then we have the CBS show Elementary. It's been a while since this was on the air, but it was really fascinating. We have Johnny Lee Miller as the Sherlock character, and then we have Lucy Liu as Dr. Joan Watson instead of Dr. John Watson. So we have women in the mix, and of course Lucy Liu is an Asian American woman. So we have been able to adapt these storylines across time, and we're still fascinated by it. And this is just a handful of the possible different ways that the Sherlock Holmes stories have been adapted throughout time. And what I was really interested, y'all, when I talk about being a nerd, but before I get into this, the random word for this video is going to be file, like a file in a folder or a file on your computer or a file that you upload for your assignment. Okay. I was really fascinated because they did live in the same time period. They were both born in Scotland, in Edinburgh. They both studied at the same college. So I went and found, I tried to do some investigating of my own. So this is from a Guardian news article. Guardian's a British news source. So strong was the resemblance that on reading Sherlock Holmes for the first time, so the resemblance between Dr. Bell as an individual and the Sherlock Holmes character. So strong was the resemblance that on reading Sherlock Holmes for the first time, another of Bell's students, Robert Louis Stevenson, wrote to Conan Doyle from Samoa, "Only one thing troubles me. Can this be my old friend Joe Bell?" Y'all, this made me so happy because not only is Stevenson in Samoa, so he's in a warmer climate, but he's reading this new character written by this guy he knows and recognizes, Dr. Bell. Anyhow, I'm that kind of nerd, and hopefully you are too. But this ends the supplemental video for this week, so take some time to look at the instructional video.